In a small-town grocery store, Walter, an elderly Korean War veteran, struggles to pay for his modest groceries, his trembling hands fumbling coins as an impatient line grows restless. Tensions rise as an annoyed man mutters complaints, and Walter's dignity hangs by a thread. Just as he considers abandoning his groceries, a voice cuts through. Michael, a younger veteran, steps forward, pays for Walter's items, and reveals Walter's heroic past, silencing the crowd. As gratitude transforms the store's atmosphere, a mystery lingers. How will this moment change Walter's life, and who else will step up to honor him? If Walter and Michael's story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Help us share stories that inspire kindness and gratitude. Comment below about the unsung heroes in your life and how we can foster respect in our communities. Together, let's honor those who quietly serve. In the harsh glow of a grocery store's fluorescent lights, Walter Henderson stood at the checkout, his frail hands sorting through a worn leather pouch. Each coin he extracted shimmered faintly, a small act of care from a man whose fingers trembled with age. On the conveyor belt sat his humble purchases, a loaf of bread, a carton of eggs, and a gallon of milk, chosen with the precision of someone who measured life in pennies. At 85, Walter lived quietly, his existence a delicate balance of routine and restraint, as if he feared occupying too much of the world's attention. Behind him, the line grew restless. A middle-aged man in a crisp shirt sighed loudly, his irritation sharp enough to pierce the store's ambient hum. "Come on, old man," he muttered, just loud enough to sting. "It's not rocket science." Walter, absorbed in his task, didn't hear the words, but they lingered like a bitter aftertaste. His fingers fumbled, and a nickel slipped free, clattering to the floor. He bent slowly, his joints protesting, his hands shaking as he reached for it. The man behind him scoffed, his impatience a heavy weight in the air. Then a voice cut through from the next lane, firm and clear. "I've got this." Michael, a young man in a worn military jacket, stepped forward, wallet in hand. His boots scraped softly as he approached, his hand landing gently on Walter's shoulder. His gaze swept the crowd, challenging their restlessness. "Without men like him," he said, his voice steady with conviction, "none of us would be standing here." The store hushed. The cashier paused, her scanner silenced mid-beep. Michael swiped his card, the machine's chirp finalizing the act. Walter looked up, his eyes wide with gratitude and surprise, as the receipt printed with a soft whir. Michael gathered the groceries, offering a small, warm grin. "Come on, sir," he said, his tone laced with respect. "Let me walk you home." Outside, rain began to fall, tapping gently against the store's windows. Walter Henderson was a man who could fade into the background, his presence soft as twilight. He moved through life with a humility that made him nearly imperceptible and a quiet figure in a world that valued noise. At 85, he was a Korean War veteran, though he kept that chapter locked away, never sharing tales of courage or loss. No medals hung in his home, no photos adorned his shelves, and he avoided the veterans group, choosing solitude over reminiscence. He lived alone in a modest, weathered house on the town's edge, its peeling paint a mirror to his own quiet endurance. His pension and Social Security checks barely sufficed, stretching thin across his needs. His wife Martha had died years ago, and their son, now distant with a family of his own, left Walter to fill the silence with routine. Walter's appearance spoke of resilience worn by time. His hands, once deft with the tools, now shook when he lifted his coffee cup or fumbled for his keys. His vision had faded, requiring him to squint close to read labels or count change. Yet his back remained straight, his clothes pressed, his shoes polished, as if defying the entropy of age. He carried a dignity that needed no fanfare, a man clinging to the independence that anchored him. Neighbors spoke of him with quiet warmth. "He fixed our porch steps when they gave out," Mrs. Franklin said, her voice soft with memory. "Showed up one morning, tools in hand, like it was nothing." Monica, a single mother nearby, smiled when she spoke of him. "He'd watch my kids when I worked late shifts. They loved him, his peppermint sticks, his terrible jokes. He'd bring them." Mr. Lewis, a retired mechanic, nodded with respect. Stubborn as hell. Even with a bad hip, he'd mow his lawn, slow as molasses, but never quit. Walter's life was simple, shaped by routine and respect. He shopped mid-morning when stores were quiet, his slow pace less likely to inconvenience others. He carried a basket, not a cart, picking only essentials: bread, eggs, milk, apples, if prices were kind. His fingers traced price tags, calculating what he could spare. Cashiers knew his face, greeted him with smiles, and he'd tip his hat, his shy smile faint but genuine. He lived gently, a man who'd seen war's cruelty and chose to meet the world with kindness. In the quiet aftermath of war, Walter carried the weight of frozen hillsides and sleepless nights, tending to wounded comrades, their cries etched into his memory like scars carved deep into his bones. The terror of those moments lingered, a silent companion he could never shake. Yet he chose not to wear his pain as a badge of honor. Instead, he returned to his small town and poured his heart into acts of quiet service, fixing a neighbor's fence, volunteering at the community center, or simply listening to those who needed an ear. His hands, weathered by time and experience, moved with purpose, and his time was given freely. His heart open to those around him. In the aisles of the local grocery store, Walter moved like a shadow, unnoticed by most, but leaving behind a trail of small kindnesses: a smile for a harried mother, a nod to a stranger, a gentle word to a child. His presence was a soft ripple in the fabric of the town, felt more than seen. On this particular afternoon, the grocery store hummed with the usual rhythm of small-town life, but the checkout line was growing restless, a simmering undercurrent of impatience. Walter stood at the front, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he rummaged through the worn leather pouch in his pocket. On the conveyor belt sat his modest haul: a loaf of white bread, a small carton of milk, a dozen eggs, and 2 crisp apples, their red skins gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He had already placed a few crumpled dollar bills on the counter, their edges soft from years of handling. Now came the harder part: counting out the coins to cover the remaining balance. His fingers, stiff from age and old injuries, moved slowly, each motion deliberate but unsteady. Behind him, the line had doubled, a restless snake of shoppers stretching toward the aisles. A man in his 40s, dressed in a pressed shirt and with a Bluetooth earpiece blinking softly, shifted his weight from foot to foot, his arms crossed tightly. His cart overflowed with snacks: bags of chips, boxes of cookies, and a case of soda, and his fingers drummed an impatient rhythm against the cart's handlebar. "Come on," he muttered, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the hum of the store. "It's not rocket science." The words hung in the air, heavy with disdain. Walter's fingers closed around a handful of coins, but a single dime slipped from his grasp, clattering to the linoleum floor with a sound that seemed to echo louder than it should. He bent slowly to retrieve it, his back stiff, his knees creaking under the weight of years and memories. Each movement was a quiet battle against time, his body no longer the agile machine it once was. The man behind him let out a sharp sigh, his head shaking in exaggerated frustration. "Seriously?" the man snapped, his voice carrying a dry, mocking laugh as he glanced around, seeking allies in the crowd. His eyes scanned the line, as if inviting others to share in his irritation. A ripple of discomfort spread through the shoppers. A woman near the back shifted her purse on her shoulder, her lips tightening as she avoided eye contact. Another shopper, a young man in a hoodie, pulled out his phone and began scrolling, trying to distance himself from the growing tension. A teenager further back popped out one earbud, his head tilting as he sensed the shift in the air, his curiosity piqued by the unfolding scene. Walter straightened, the dime pinched between his fingers, and offered a quiet, almost apologetic glance at the cashier. Emily, barely out of high school, stood behind the register, her face a mixture of sympathy and uncertainty. Her ponytail bobbed slightly as she leaned forward, offering a hesitant smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was new to the job, still learning the rhythms of the store, and the weight of the line's impatience pressed against her. She glanced toward the next register, hoping to catch the eye of a supervisor, but the other cashier was buried in her own line, and the manager was nowhere to be found. "Sir, take your time," Emily said softly, her voice wavering as she tried to balance kindness with the pressure of the moment. Walter gave a tiny nod, his focus returning to the task at hand. His lips moved silently as he counted under his breath, arranging the nickels and dimes in neat rows on the counter. Each coin was placed with care, but his trembling hands betrayed him, and the simple arithmetic felt like scaling a mountain. The numbers swam in his mind, tangled by the weight of the eyes boring into his back. The man behind him stepped forward, his foot tapping sharply against the cart. "Unbelievable," he muttered, his voice louder now, cutting through the air like a blade. "This is why I shop online." His words sparked a murmur from the line. A woman in a floral scarf clucked her tongue, her impatience bubbling to the surface. Another shopper, a middle-aged man with a tired expression, rolled his eyes and leaned toward his friend to whisper something. Their heads bent together in shared frustration. A little boy, perched in a shopping cart near the mom, tugged at his mother's sleeve, his voice high and curious. "Mom, why's the line not moving?" His mother shushed him gently, her eyes darting to Walter with a mix of pity and exasperation. Walter's cheeks flushed a deep red, the heat creeping up his neck as he felt the weight of the line's collective gaze. His heart thudded in his chest, a familiar pang of shame twisting in his gut. He reached into his pocket again, his fingers brushing against nothing but lint. He checked his coat pocket, then the other side of his pants, pausing each time as if willing a hidden coin to appear. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment his eyes flickered to Emily, a silent plea in their depths. He was coming up short, and the realization hit him like a cold wave. Emily opened her mouth, her instinct to help warring with her uncertainty. Should she cover the last dollar herself? Was that even allowed? Her mind raced, searching for the right move, but the store's rules loomed large, and she hesitated, glancing again toward the empty manager's station. The line seemed to lean forward, a collective weight of unspoken frustrations pressing against Walter's hunched shoulders. His fingers hovered over the coins on the counter, trembling as if he were on the verge of sweeping them up and walking away. The thought of leaving empty-handed, head bowed in defeat, hung heavy in the air, a possibility so tangible it seemed to cast a shadow over the scene. Walter's chest tightened, his mind flashing to the countless times he'd faced far worse. Nights in the cold, the screams of the injured, the terror of not knowing if dawn would come. Yet here, in this small grocery store, the simple act of paying for his groceries felt like a battle he might not win. The teenager a few spots back had stopped scrolling his phone, his brow furrowed as he watched Walter struggle. His earlier indifference gave way to a flicker of empathy, his fingers tightening around his phone as he took in the old man's trembling hands. The woman who had been shaking her head was now chewing her lip, her earlier frustration softening into something closer to guilt. Even the impatient man's bluster had quieted, his arms still crossed, but his foot no longer tapping, as if the weight of the moment had settled over him too. The air in the checkout line was thick with unspoken emotions, frustration, shame, pity, and the faint stirrings of compassion. Each person caught in their own thoughts, watching as Walter stood at the edge of a quiet, personal precipice. Walter shuffled his feet, the linoleum floor squeaking faintly under his worn loafers, his eyes glued to the cracked screen of his old phone. He wasn't really scrolling, just staring, using the device as a shield against the weight of the glances around him. The checkout line at the grocery store felt like a gauntlet, each pair of eyes a silent judgment. His fingers, gnarled from years of labor and war, fumbled nervously with the frayed pouch in his pocket, searching for coins that weren't there. His heart thudded with a quiet panic, a familiar shame creeping up his spine. He'd been here before, standing at a counter, coming up short, the world watching. The air in the store felt thick, heavy with unspoken impatience from the line behind him. Every second stretched into an eternity, and Walter's chest tightened, his breath shallow, as he braced for the inevitable moment of humiliation. Emily, the young cashier, barely out of her teens, flicked her gaze toward the other checkout lane, hoping for a distraction, a way to ease the tension. Her hands hovered over the register, unsure whether to speak or wait. She could see the strain in Walter's hunched shoulders, the way his fingers trembled as they sifted through the same pile of coins he'd already counted twice. She wanted to say something, anything to break the silence, but the words caught in her throat. The line behind Walter grew restless. Sighs, shifting feet, the faint tap of a phone screen. The tension was a taut wire ready to snap, and for a moment, it seemed the entire store was holding its breath, waiting for the moment to break. Then, like a blade slicing through the heavy quiet, a voice rang out. Not Emily's, not the manager's, but a stranger's, calm yet commanding, cutting through the haze of discomfort. I've got this. The words were steady, unyielding, and they shifted the air in the room. Every head in the line turned, eyes locking onto the man who stepped forward from halfway down the queue. Michael, in his mid-30s, moved with a quiet confidence, his faded military jacket hanging loosely on his frame. The patches on the sleeves, once vibrant emblems of service, were frayed but unmistakable to those who recognized their meaning. His boots, scuffed and practical, thudded softly against the floor, and his jeans, worn but clean, spoke of a man who valued function over flash. There was a strength in his stride, not aggressive but assured, the kind that came from years of carrying burdens heavier than groceries. Walter froze, his finger still hovering over the pitiful pile of coins on the counter. His eyes, clouded with age and worry, lifted slowly, meeting Michael's gaze. Confusion flickered across his face, then gave way to a stunned, almost childlike wonder. Michael placed a hand on Walter's shoulder, the gesture gentle but firm, grounding. "Let me take care of this, sir," he said, his voice low and warm, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You've done enough." The words hit Walter like a wave, stirring something deep within him. Memories of sacrifice, of battles fought in distant lands, of a life spent giving more than he ever took. His cheeks, already flushed with embarrassment, burned deeper, but his eyes shimmered with a mix of emotions: gratitude, disbelief, and a flicker of pride he hadn't felt in years. Michael turned to face the line, his presence commanding attention without effort. He raised his voice just enough to carry, his tone steady, but laced with conviction. "If it weren't for men like him, none of us would be standing here today." The words landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of silence through the aisle. The man at the front of the line, his Bluetooth headset blinking, suddenly found the floor tiles fascinating, his earlier impatience dissolving into something quieter, humbler. A woman near the back who moments ago had been shaking her head in frustration, now averted her eyes, her cheeks tinged with shame. A teenager with earbuds dangling from one ear stared wide-eyed, caught off guard by the weight of the moment. Emily, behind the counter, let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her shoulders relaxing as a small, relieved smile crept across her face. She watched as Michael slid his card into the machine. The transaction completed in seconds, the total covered without fanfare. The receipt printed with a soft whir, and Emily packed Walter's groceries into a bag. Bread, a few cans, a small carton of milk. The moment, though brief, seemed to stretch, as if the entire store had paused to bear witness. Michael handed the bag to Walter, who took it with hands that still trembled, not from embarrassment now, but from the overwhelming rush of emotions he couldn't quite name. His grip tightened on the plastic handles, his knuckles whitening as he searched Michael's face, looking for answers, for some explanation for this unexpected kindness. I don't know what to say," Walter murmured, his voice rough, thick with the weight of gratitude and years of buried pain. Michael extended his hand, his grin widening, easy and genuine. "No need to say anything, sir." Walter hesitated, then reached out, his own hand shaking as he clasped Michael's in a grip that was surprisingly firm, as if channeling a strength he'd thought long gone. For a moment they stood there, two men from different worlds, different wars, different lifetimes, yet bound by something unspoken. The years between them melted away, and in that handshake, they were equals. Two soldiers, two survivors, connected by a shared understanding of sacrifice. Then Michael stepped back, and with a fluid, practiced motion, he raised his right hand in a sharp military salute. The gesture was crisp, deliberate, a tribute that carried the weight of history. Walter's breath caught in his throat, his free hand rising instinctively to his brow, returning the salute with all the strength his aging body could muster. His eyes were wet now, tears brimming, but not falling, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't look away. He stood tall, his shoulders squared, the ghost of the man he'd once been shining through the frailty of age. The store seemed to exhale, the tension dissolving into something softer, more human. A few customers nodded quietly, their earlier impatience replaced by respect. A woman near the bakery section dabbed at her eyes with a crumpled tissue, her expression a mix of awe and sorrow. The man with the Bluetooth shifted his weight, muttering something under his breath that sounded like an apology, his voice too low to carry. Emily, still smiling, looked at Walter and said softly, "Thank you, sir, for everything." Her words were simple, but they carried a sincerity that made Walter's chest swell with a pride he hadn't felt in decades. As Michael turned to leave, Walter reached out, his fingers brushing the younger man's arm. "Wait," he said, his voice quiet but insistent. "What's your name, son?" Michael paused, turning back with a grin that lit up his eyes. "Michael," he replied. "Michael Carter." Walter squeezed his arm gently, his voice thick with emotion. "You've done your family proud, Michael." For a moment, Michael's eyes softened, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through his steady demeanor. They stood there, two men bound by a moment that felt bigger than the sum of its parts, a quiet acknowledgement of shared sacrifice and unspoken brotherhood. In the quiet hum of the grocery store, the weight of a shared history hung between Michael and Walter, a bond forged not in words but in the unspoken gravity of lives forever intertwined. As Michael moved toward the exit, his steps deliberate, he carried with him the echoes of a story that had shaped his existence. Behind him, Walter stood a little straighter, his shoulders squared with a newfound dignity. His chin tilted upward, catching the soft fluorescent light, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, a smile broke across his face. It wasn't the tight, courteous smile he'd worn like a mask for years, but a genuine one, radiating warmth that softened the deep lines etched into his weathered skin. His eyes, often dimmed by the weight of time, sparkled with a quiet pride, as if a long-buried part of him had been unearthed and acknowledged at last. Outside, the automatic doors slid open with a gentle hiss, ushering Michael into the golden glow of the late afternoon. The fading sunlight bathed the parking lot in a warm amber hue, and he paused for a moment, letting the breeze carry away the weight of the encounter. Inside, Walter gripped his grocery bag tightly, his hands trembling, not from age but from the surge of emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He moved slowly toward the exit, his steps measured, as if savoring the moment. The crowd around him parted instinctively, not out of pity or obligation, but with a quiet reverence. Heads dipped slightly as he passed, a subtle gesture of respect that spoke louder than words. For a fleeting, unforgettable moment, Walter Henderson was no longer just the quiet old man from the end of Maple Street, the one who shuffled through life unnoticed. He was a veteran, a hero, a man whose quiet courage had rippled through time, now seen and honored by those around him. At the checkout counter, Michael lingered, his gaze drifting back to Walter, who was still clutching his grocery bag with a mix of pride and disbelief. Emily, the young cashier with a ponytail and a name tag slightly askew, stood frozen, her eyes flickering between the two men. A blend of awe and curiosity danced across her face, her usual brisk efficiency replaced by a quiet stillness. Michael caught her gaze and leaned in, his voice low but clear, just audible over the soft murmur of the store. "You know," he said, his tone warm with reverence, "that man saved my father's life." Emily's eyes widened, a sudden spark of realization illuminating her face like the first rays of dawn breaking through a long night. She glanced at Walter again, her breath catching as the weight of Michael's words settled in. Michael leaned against the counter, his posture relaxed but his eyes distant, as if replaying a memory he'd carried his entire life. "My dad served with him in Korea," he continued, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "I grew up hearing the stories, the kind that stick with you forever. One night, there was an ambush, gunfire, the kind of nightmare you don't walk away from. My dad was pinned down, wounded, terrified, certain he was done for. He used to tell me how the world narrowed to just the sound of his own heartbeat and the screams around him. And then, out of nowhere, Henderson." Michael nodded toward Walter, who was now nearing the automatic doors, oblivious to the conversation unfolding just steps away, came crawling through the enemy fire. Didn't hesitate, didn't flinch. He dragged my dad out of that hell, carried him back to safety, saved his life without a second thought. Emily's throat tightened, a lump forming as she watched Walter's slow, deliberate steps. She saw him differently now, not just an elderly customer, but a man who had faced unimaginable danger and emerged with quiet, unassuming grace. Michael's voice softened further, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "My dad used to say, 'You wouldn't be here, son, if it weren't for Henderson.'" That name was like a legend in our house, part of the fabric of our family. But the thing is, Walter never made a big deal of it. He didn't come home waving a flag or demanding recognition. He just went back to living, quietly, humbly, like it was nothing. Emily's shoulders, tense from the rush of the day, seemed to soften, her earlier impatience melting into something tender and reverent. She blinked rapidly, her eyes glistening as she processed the enormity of what she just learned. Michael shook his head, his smile tinged with admiration and disbelief. "I didn't even know where to find him for the longest time. My dad passed a few years back, and I made it my mission to track Walter down, just to say thank you. I scoured veteran groups online, dug through military reunion boards, reached out to old contacts. Took months, but finally his name popped up in a veterans registry. Turns out he's been living just a few miles from here, in that little house on Maple Street, all this time." Emily's mouth parted slightly, astonishment flickering across her face. "And today," Michael added with a quiet chuckle, "was the first time I saw him in person. I came in here for coffee and some groceries, never expecting this moment to just happen." His voice carried a mix of gratitude and wonder, as if fate had orchestrated this encounter with a precision he couldn't quite fathom. Emily swallowed hard, the weight of the moment settling deep within her, like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through her thoughts. At the front of the store, a subtle shift moved through the other customers. Those who had muttered under their breath or sighed impatiently just minutes earlier now looked at Walter with softened expressions, their eyes reflecting a newfound respect. A woman nearby leaned toward her young daughter, whispering softly, her words gentle but urgent, as if passing down a piece of living history. The man who had stood with crossed arms, his face tight with frustration, now rubbed the back of his neck, his gaze lowered in quiet shame. The air in the store felt different now, charged with a collective recognition of Walter's unspoken legacy. Michael turned to Emily one last time, his voice steady but warm. "You know, he's a local hero, but for years he's been invisible. People forgot, or maybe they never even knew." His words hung in the air, a quiet challenge to remember, to see. Emily nodded, her expression thoughtful, her voice barely above a whisper. "Well," she said, her tone soft but resolute, "they know now." Michael let out a small, appreciative laugh, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Yeah," he said, glancing toward Walter one final time as the older man reached the automatic doors, ready to step into the fading light. "They do." As Walter prepared to step out into the fading afternoon light, he paused, his weathered hand clutching the grocery bag tightly. His eyes, still glistening with unshed tears, met Michael's across the crowded store. In that fleeting moment, a quiet understanding passed between them, a wordless bond forged by a single, courageous act that had rippled through decades, connecting two souls from vastly different worlds. Walter's lips curved into a faint, grateful nod, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and humility. Michael, younger but carrying the weight of his own history, returned the gesture with a steady gaze, his chest tightening with the realization of what this moment meant. For him, it wasn't just a nod, it was an acknowledgement of a debt repaid, a story honored, a life's worth of quiet sacrifice finally seen. Emily, standing behind the register, caught the exchange and felt her breath catch in her throat. Her hands, usually quick and efficient as they scanned items, paused for a moment. She watched Michael take a deep breath, his shoulders relaxing as if a burden had been lifted, before he turned to follow Walter toward the exit. A soft smile lingered on his face, a reflection of the peace that had settled in his heart. For Emily, the grocery store, normally a whirlwind of ringing scanners, hurried customers, and endless tasks, felt different now. It was no longer just a place of commerce, a backdrop to the mundane rhythm of daily life. In that moment, it had transformed into something sacred. A quiet stage where humanity and history had intertwined, where a long overdue thank you had been spoken, not in words but in the weight of shared glances and unspoken gratitude. As Walter and Michael moved toward the glass doors, the store seemed to hold its breath. The usual hum of activity, the clatter of carts, the rustle of plastic bags, the impatient sighs of shoppers, faded into a gentle stillness. The air felt lighter, as if the weight of routine had been lifted, replaced by a quiet awareness that something profound had just unfolded. Customers, who moments ago had been absorbed in their own worlds, now seemed to sense it too. Their hurried movements slowed, their eyes softened, and a subtle shift in the atmosphere hinted at a shared recognition of gratitude, of connection, of something bigger than themselves. Walter stood near the exit, his grocery bag crinkling in his grip as he dabbed at the corner of his eyes with a trembling hand. The weight of the moment pressed against his chest. Decades of memories, of battles fought, of sacrifices made, now met with this unexpected outpouring of kindness. He felt exposed, yet deeply moved, as if the world had suddenly turned its gaze toward him after years of quiet anonymity. Then something extraordinary began to unfold. It started with a soft voice from the back of the checkout line. A woman in a blue coat, her knuckles white from clutching her purse so tightly just minutes before, loosened her grip. Her face, etched with the lines of a long day, softened as she reached into her purse and pulled out a few folded bills. She stepped forward, her movements hesitant but deliberate, and pressed the money into Emily's hand. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes flickering toward Walter with a mix of respect and tenderness. "Use this for his next trip here." Emily froze, her heart skipping a beat as she glanced between the woman and Walter, who stood unaware near the door. After a moment, she nodded, her throat tight with emotion, and accepted the bills with a quiet, "Thank you." The gesture rippled through the store like a pebble dropped in still water. A young father, standing nearby with his toddler's tiny hand clasped in his, felt a tug at his heart. He'd been distracted earlier, juggling the demands of parenting and the impatience of a long day. But now his focus shifted. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a crumpled $10 bill. "Add me in," he said, his voice steady but warm, as he handed the money to Emily. His daughter, barely old enough to understand the world around her, slipped free from his grasp. With the fearless curiosity of a child, she toddled over to Walter, her small arms wrapping around his leg in a spontaneous embrace. Walter froze, his breath catching, as he looked down at the little girl, her innocent affection piercing through the walls he'd built over years of solitude. His hand, trembling with age and emotion, rested gently on her soft curls. For a moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them, her unassuming love and his quiet astonishment. His face, still damp with tears, softened into a smile that carried the weight of a lifetime. From the bakery counter, an employee approached, her apron dusted with flour and her eyes bright with purpose. In her hands was a small box, tied with a simple ribbon, containing a fresh loaf of bread and a slice of cake. "For you, sir," she said softly, placing the box on the counter beside Walter. Her voice trembled slightly, as if she too felt the gravity of the moment. Walter blinked, his lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. He simply nodded, his heart too full to express the gratitude swelling within him. Then came the store manager, Stan, his brisk steps echoing from the back office. His name tag gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and his face, usually lined with the exhaustion of managing a bustling store, carried a different expression today, one of quiet resolve. He approached Walter with an outstretched hand, his eyes steady and sincere. "Sir," he said, his voice firm but kind, "from now on, anytime you need anything, groceries, help, whatever, you come see me. We'll make sure you're taken care of. No charge." Walter's eyes widened, his mouth opening as if to protest, but Stan's gentle squeeze on his shoulder silenced him. "It's the least we can do," Stan added, his voice softening. For Stan, this wasn't just about policy or goodwill, it was personal. He saw in Walter the face of his own grandfather, a man who had carried his own burdens silently, and he felt a pang of regret for all the times he hadn't done more for those who came before him. Around them, the mood in the store shifted palpably. Customers who had been tapping their feet or glancing at their watches now stood still, their attention drawn to Walter. Some looked at him with softened eyes, their expressions a mix of admiration and reflection. Others seemed to carry a quiet shame, as if suddenly aware of their earlier impatience. Among them was the man who had been the loudest complainer, his Bluetooth earpiece still blinking in his ear, his arms no longer crossed in frustration. "I feel ashamed," he muttered, almost to himself, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. His voice carried a raw honesty, a confession of his own shortcomings in the face of something greater. A woman standing next to him nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the floor, her own thoughts turning inward as she reconsidered her earlier haste. Near the produce section, two teenagers who had been horsing around just moments ago now stood in stunned silence. Their usual bravado had melted away, replaced by a rare moment of stillness. One of them, his baseball cap clutched loosely at his side, stared at Walter with wide eyes, as if seeing something he hadn't noticed before. A living piece of history, a reminder of the sacrifices that had shaped the world he took for granted. His friend shifted uncomfortably, his usual smirk gone, replaced by a quiet respect that he didn't quite know how to process. The energy in the store had transformed entirely. What had been a space of frustration and impatience now hummed with reflection and connection. It was as if every person present had been gently nudged awake, reminded of truths they'd buried beneath the weight of daily life, the importance of respect, the power of a single act of kindness, the beauty of gratitude given freely. Walter, blinking back fresh tears, looked up at Michael, who stood quietly nearby, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. Michael's face was calm, but his eyes shone with a quiet satisfaction, as if he, too, felt the shift in the air. For him, this moment was a closing of a circle, a chance to honor a man whose bravery had touched his life long before they had ever met. As Walter stepped out into the afternoon light, his grocery bag in one hand and the gifted box in the other, he carried with him not just the tangible offerings of the store, but something far greater, a renewed sense of being seen, of being valued, of being remembered. And for those left behind in the store, the moment lingered, a quiet reminder that even in the most ordinary places, humanity could shine through, leaving the world just a little brighter, a little kinder, a little more connected. The moment hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Michael's nod was subtle, a quiet gesture that carried a world of understanding. It was as if he were saying, without words, "Look at this, Walter, they see you, they remember." His eyes, steady and kind, held a warmth that reached deep, stirring something in Walter's chest. For Walter, the weight of that moment was almost too much to bear. His throat tightened, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough, trembling with a tide of emotion he hadn't let himself feel in years. "I don't know what to say," he managed, the words barely a whisper, as if saying more might break the fragile dam holding back his tears. He wasn't used to this, being seen, being felt. Not after so many years of moving through life like a shadow, unnoticed yet ever present. Michael's hand found Walter's shoulder, a steady anchor in the storm of feeling. "You don't have to say anything," he said softly, his voice low but firm, like he understood the weight of silence better than most. His touch was gentle but sure, grounding Walter in a moment that felt both fleeting and eternal. It was a reassurance that didn't demand words, only presence. A reminder that sometimes the deepest connections are forged in quiet understanding. As Walter turned to leave, his steps slow and deliberate, the air around him seemed to shift. A small crowd had gathered near the door of the little grocery store on Maple Street, their faces lit with something more than curiosity. It was respect, gratitude, maybe even a touch of awe. Children, their eyes wide with unfiltered affection, darted forward, wrapping their small arms around Walter's legs. Their laughter was soft but bright, their hugs clumsy yet sincere, as if they sensed he was someone who mattered, even if they didn't fully understand why. Parents stepped forward, their handshakes firm and their smiles tentative but warm, like they were reaching across an invisible divide to honor a man who had never asked for it. Others, more discreet, slipped gift cards or folded bills into the cashier's hand, whispering that they were for Walter's next visit. Each gesture, small as it was, felt like a stitch in a tapestry of kindness, weaving a moment that none of them would soon forget. Walter stepped out into the afternoon sun, the warmth of it brushing against his weathered face. For the first time in what felt like decades, he felt the weight of being truly seen. Not for medals pinned to a uniform, not for grand speeches or heroic tales, but for the quiet, steadfast life he had lived. The sacrifices he'd made, the ones no one ever asked about, seemed to shimmer in the light of that moment. He'd carried those burdens alone for so long, nights spent staring at the ceiling, memories of battles fought and friends lost, choices made that no one else could understand. Yet here, in this small town, in this unassuming grocery store, he felt the community's gratitude wrap around him like a long-forgotten embrace. It wasn't just appreciation. It was honor, raw and unpolished, for the example he'd set simply by showing up, day after day, with quiet dignity. Behind him, the grocery store on Maple Street felt different. It wasn't just a place to buy milk or bread anymore. The air inside seemed to hum with a new kind of warmth, a humanity that lingered in the aisles. The fluorescent lights felt softer, the chatter of customers a little kinder. It was as if Walter's presence, in the community's response to it, had transformed the space into something more, a testament to the power of small, intentional acts of care. The store wasn't just a store anymore. It was a place where people had chosen to see each other, to pause and acknowledge the stories carried in quiet hearts. Walter's story wasn't just about one moment, though. It was a reflection of something deeper, something that pulsed at the heart of what it meant to live in a community that cared. In a world that often rushed past, where screens and schedules drowned out the quiet moments, Walter's experience was a reminder to stop and look around. The person standing in line behind you, moving a little slower, their hands trembling as they count out change. They might carry a story of courage, of resilience, of sacrifices made in silence. They might be a veteran like Walter, or a teacher who shaped lives without ever seeking praise, or a neighbor who quietly helped others without expecting thanks. These were the unsung heroes, their stories etched in the lines of their faces, in the steady rhythm of their everyday lives. The deeper truth in Walter's story wasn't just about honoring veterans, though that was a piece of it, a vital one. It was about how people choose to show up for one another, in the small, ordinary moments that make up a life. Gratitude wasn't something to be reserved for holidays or grand gestures. It lived in the choice to give up a seat on a crowded bus, to carry a neighbor's groceries, to offer a smile or a moment of patience when someone was struggling. It was in the way a community could rally around one of its own, not with fanfare, but with quiet, heartfelt gestures that said, "You matter. We see you." For those who had lived through different times, Walter's story might stir memories of a world where neighbors knew each other's names, where front porches were gathering places, and respect for elders was woven into the fabric of daily life. Those days felt distant now, faded like old photographs, but the values they held, connection, respect, gratitude, were still within reach. The challenge was to keep them alive, to ensure they weren't lost in the noise of modern life. For younger generations, the story was a call to pause and reflect. How do we honor the quiet heroes among us? How do we build communities where no one feels invisible? Walter's moment in the grocery store was a spark, a reminder that kindness and gratitude could ripple outward, touching lives in ways no one could predict. It was a call to look up from our distractions, to see the people around us, not just their faces, but their stories, their sacrifices, their quiet strength. It was a challenge to live with intention, to make gratitude not just a word, but a way of being, woven into the small choices that shape a community, a life, a world.